Alrighty, so I'm ready to talk about what I think are the most important cards in Star Wars Unlimited today. This conversation is going to mostly involve talking about cards that are popular in meta decks, cards that I think people need to focus on. It's not entirely a best cards list, although there is a ton of overlap with that, but a lot of it is about cards that are really important specific archetypes or cards you really need to consider when you're like in a game and when like certain game situations might come up and things that you might need to play around, right? There's cards that might not make this list that are obviously very powerful, but they're more just like linearly good and not so much conversation to be had about them. But before we get going, please do hit that subscribe button. It helps out a lot. And also go check out my Patreon. A lot of cool stuff there. Some new stuff coming up shortly as well. All right. So just the goals here. Number one, top X lists are fun. This is going to be a top 20 list. Just a good time. Going to talk about the impact these cards have on the meta. I'm going to talk about their importance in the decks they're in. Tips on how to use them. Tips on how to play against them. You know, it's just an excuse to talk about these cards. I'll miss some, I'm certain of it. And also, set 3. Wow, where are you? I think including the honorable mentions and the top 20, and also the top 20, there's like multiple cards in some of that list, so it's actually more than 20 cards. I think I only hit 5 cards from set 3, and it's easily close to 40 cards on the list, probably. So that's kind of unfortunate for set 3. But yeah, here are the honorable mentions. These are more just, I think mostly these are just like strong cards. I put like Surprise Strike here, McClunky. Now there are 2 of them. Like now there are 2 of them is actually you do really need to consider in some very specific decks, something like CAD Bane that plays this, and like you need to make sure you don't get got by like a turn 2 Zuckuss or something. P38 is obviously a very core card in the Django deck. You know, Darth Vader and Relentless are really important cards for the Villain Green decks. Villain Green deck is not entirely popular right now. I think Relentless on its own is only really important against like hard control decks like Bossk Blue, but is an incredibly important card against those matchups, which is why it made this list, possibly could have made the top 20 just because of how vital it is for those boss decks to consider it, and also how vital it is for the Villain Green decks to have it when playing in that matchup. Poe, you know, I included the other big guy from this Hero Red in the top 20, but Poe doesn't quite make it. For a Cause I Believe In, obviously, is like one of the best reach cards in the game. Avenger, one of the best closers for villain decks. Power of the Dark Side, very clean removal. Childson is a card that decks really need to consider when they're playing against, mostly, again, like the hard control decks. How can they beat a turn 3 6/6? They have to have a plan for that sequence. And then Hot Shot Blaster, mostly just because it's a really cool card and really good card. It's not really like an archetype definer by any means. All right, at number 20, I put Cunning. Now, while I know mono yellow decks are not incredibly popular right now, I think mono yellow Han is likely the one you're going to see the most, and there will be some other conversations we have about that mono yellow Han with some cards later on this list. You might see things like Asajj sometimes as like a mono yellow deck. Maybe you'll see like a Django or a CAD, but for the most part, this card is a feature of the mono yellow Han deck, but it is a card you very much need to consider when you're playing, because this is one of the swingiest like damage racing cards in the game, right? Because its ability to not only give you a +4 but prevent 2 things from attacking you can sometimes mean 12 damage swings, right? Like you +4 them -8 or something like that. This card is incredibly powerful. It is a big focus of mono yellow decks. The discard angle on this as well can really tax some decks in conjunction with other yellow discard effects. Think Bodhi, think Spark of Rebellion. We'll talk about those later. But yeah, I think Cunning, although not like mono yellow not being incredibly popular right now in general, is still a card you very much need to have in your mind. And at 19, I put Dr. Persing. Now this card is actually really annoying for all these decks trying to discard cards from your hand. A turn 1 Persing is a really scary thing when your game plan into control decks is to attrition them, either with discard effects or lots of 2-for-1s. Dr. Persing is a big worry, and one of the things that these decks think maybe even Kira or Krennic, they want to find this guy on turn 1. It changes a lot of how the texture of a game works when this card is in play on the first turn versus when it's not, and you very much need to consider it. Like, what should you be doing on turn 1? Like, if you're worried about this and you have the option to go space or ground on turn 1, you probably need to start ground so that you can get this guy off the table. Persing, just really powerful early. He's a little bit less good later, right? Because it's a very slow engine. But the games where you can start with this in a control deck versus when you can't look wildly different sometimes. At 18, I put Dark Saber. I don't think this is the most important piece of a green Sabine deck, but I do think it's the one that sometimes enables the most free wins. And a card that I think at this point most people that play against Sabine know exists, and know that if they can't beat this on turn 3, they probably need to find a way to do so with the deck they're playing. It's just like an omnipresent threat. It's like the fear of it is sometimes even bigger than its actual impact on a game. But yes, this is a game stealer, and it's mostly just being played, of course, in Sabine because it's such a cheap leader to flip and then slam this on. You get some tiny upside with the Mandalorian text on this, although very rarely that comes up. All right, at 17, I've got the Ramp Friend. So we see 2 cards here. They take up 1 slot in this review. It's Super Laser Tech and Resupply. Ramp is still very powerful, and I do think these villain ramp decks they're not in the best spot in the meta right now. I do think the decks are still pretty powerful. Kira, Krennic, Palpatine, those are usually the most common ones that will be playing ramp. But ramp mechanic in this game is incredibly powerful because, the punishment for ramp in general is that you're kind of taking a turn off, right? Resupply does nothing. Super Laser Tech does barely anything when you play them. But then it enables larger plays later. But in this game specifically, because leaders are free to play, right? The quicker you get to them, the quicker you regain that tempo back that you may have lost by playing something that didn't impact the game. And I think because of that, ramp is actually even more powerful here than it might have otherwise been. You're just getting, like, you take a turn off, but your next turn is so crazy because you get like an extra resource plus a free leader deploy. That especially happens when you're playing 5-cost leaders, right? That's kind of brutal. So these cards are very good. The decks themselves, not entirely at the top of the meta right now, but definitely think you need to be aware that there will be decks trying to ramp, and ramping is good. And heroes, they don't get Super Laser Tech. They get Spark of Hope, which unfortunately doesn't really do the trick a lot of the time, but they still do Resupply. So some of these green hero decks can sometimes also spike or ramp. It's not nearly as common as the villain decks, but yeah, I think that's the main reason why villain ramp is much more of a solidified strategy. And at 16, I'm going to put Overwhelm Barrage, which is one of the things you want to do after you ramp in a villain green deck. This is still one of the most premium cards in the game. And again, just because it's not super popular right now because the decks it's in aren't smashing every tournament doesn't mean that it won't be super popular tomorrow. Overwhelm Barrage is still just kind of crazy how good this card is. It's even better with 5-cost leaders, same as those ramps, right? Because it gives you a free target for the Overwhelm Barrage. Like Barrage, I've seen sometimes, and I myself have sometimes cut it from Palpatine decks because he's spending so much time trying to prevent damage and ramp that he often doesn't even have a target for this card. His leader comes out so late. But the 5-cost leaders, when they get to do this, even a boss green deck, Akira, Krennic, he's not the best target for this, but in general, you can get such a huge board swing out of this card. It can go space, it can go ground. The unit you put it on can then trade up as well. Barrage is really, really good, and there's a lot of shielded units now, and partially that's a reason why this card has maybe gone down a little in total value, but still one of the best cards in the game. And at 15, we finally have the first set 3 card on this list, although I think I had put a couple up in the honorable mentions. I did for sure have, now there are 2 of them. But CAD Bane is, you know, he's entered the world of like very powerful 7-drop units that we're actually going to go like through a few of them right now. Like we had Darth Vader in the honorable mentions. There's like a bunch of other ones. And he has entered into that conversation. He is on that power level. He is used now in a couple meta decks like Django and CAD Bane. You know, much more of a focus of the CAD Bane deck, but he is definitely a very important part of the Django deck. He comes in and, you know, can kind of exhaust an entire board. He can steal multiple units, and then even if he's defeated, those units come back into play exhausted, right? So he can be a pretty major tempo swing in a game. The stats, of course, are very powerful. So, like, if he gets that 7 damage in it, like, and your opponent, like, getting to free a thing on his attack is often, like, not even the thing they want to do because he would draw 2 cards. So, CAD is very powerful. Now, there is some play around on this card. Something like the L337, the Leap Droid, being able to free things has come up quite a lot for me against this card. It's really interesting that a card that I was playing basically entirely to be a 2/2 shielded unit, which was already good enough, and it had Smuggle, was just like, yes, I just wanted this card in decks, but now it kind of hard counters this card a lot of the time, which is really good. There's a few other things that can kind of really get CAD. So Millennium Falcon is another one. If you're under pressure and you and CAD is supposed to be your stabilizer, Millennium Falcon is actually a tricky card because when you capture it, if you attack with CAD Bane and they free it, it actually will be ready when they get there, if they choose to free it back. So you could be expecting to take 3 damage, potentially even 6 or something if they have surprise strike. So you might not even be able to attack with CAD Bane if that's the issue, if that happens. Lastly, and you know, another yellow hero card. So I just mentioned 2, right? The Elite Droid and Millennium Falcon, but Han Solo in a Quinlan deck can also one-shot this card, which is another kind of counterplay to CAD Bane. So CAD Bane does have his issues. He is not like an auto like game winner, but he's also very powerful. Remember that with the CAD Bane leader, you can actually choose to do the damage with CAD Bane's leader effect before you do the capture, which means, for instance, if your opponent had 9 health worth of units, you can do that 1 damage and then still capture all the units because CAD Bane does 8 or less. So CAD Bane enters the pool of really good 7-drop finishers, and let's talk about a few more. Well, this is not a 7-cost finisher, sorry, but it's an 8-cost one, and it's Supreme Leader Snoke. This card is very important for decks trying to go long and beat Django. Most decks that go long need, like, they're mostly blue villain decks, let's be real. But blue villain decks, this is kind of the game closer in a lot of situations. It's gotten even better in this set because of how popular space decks have become and how this card interacts well with those decks, right? 7 Fleet Defender, Lurking TIE Phantom, P-38, Kylo's TIE, they all die to this. Cards like Ruthless Raider become much more manageable when they only hit you for 2 a turn. And at the same time, Snoke prevents your opponent from playing a lot of cards into this. Han Solo, for instance, can't one-shot this because he only attacks for 4. There's just a lot going on for Snoke. It's become a pretty core card in the Bosk Blue deck. And all these decks that are trying to beat villain blue decks, this needs to be in their mind. And a lot of time, these decks are playing Tarkin Town these days, and in many cases, you want to save that Tarkin Town for later. Now, Tarkin Town can be used a lot of the way before you reach 8 resources, like finishing off a Dr. Pershing, for instance, is sometimes very enticing with Tarkin Town. But if you are worried that this might hose you, you might need to save that Tarkin Town. You know, CAD Bane in the Django deck can eat this guy, which sometimes is all it takes because they use all the resources and then you get a turn to hit them for full power on with units that they thought were going to be shrunk. So there is play around, but this is a very important card right now. So here we do have another one of those 7-cost finishers. This one is Luke Skywalker. This, in my opinion, is basically the reason you would want to be playing Hero Blue right now. This card is very, very powerful. This is the, maybe pound for pound, the most powerful unit in the game. Now, the Blue Hero archetype is a bit slow sometimes. It's very, like, curve dependent. A lot of its units, you just kind of go up the ladder. But Luke is the pinnacle, and he's kind of the reason you're doing this, because this card is a huge stabilizing force. Removal built in, a clock built in, and the ability to heal, making you start to be able to push damage while preventing it at the same time. One of the most important cards for these archetypes, if not the most important card. I think if this card didn't exist, Blue Hero would be in a really, really bad spot. There's not really play around this guy other than, you know, if there's ways to mitigate the -6/-6 if you're able to sequence a turn so that you don't have to defeat anything before this guy comes into play. Of course, he can still defeat things even if he doesn't do the full -6/-6. What's neat about this, we mentioned it with CAD Bane, the Han Solo unit in the Quinlan deck will one-shot this Luke. So Han, I know I've mentioned him a few times, he's going to show up in a little bit because of all this new synergy. And he's right there. So Han has always been an incredibly powerful card. I didn't have him quite on the level of things like Luke and Vader, although still he was really, really strong. And I was playing with this guy in like the Boba Hero, like Hero Boba deck, where he could come down and do a 7 ambush, and that was so awesome. And you know what? Now he gets to do it, and he gets to do it with a 5-cost leader, and that's Quinlan, right? It's not quite a 7 ambush, right? But since he can deal a damage before doing the ambush, essentially becomes the same thing. So this guy can now start to come down and one-shot a lot of these units that were basically hard counters to him, right? Like Luke was kind of a hard counter to Han. Now Han can counter the Luke back. He can defeat the CAD Bane leader. He can one-shot basically any leader in the game other than the really, really massive ones if your Quinlan's out, right? The Quinlan being out changes that math a bit. But you know what? Even without Quinlan, this guy has been a core card of the mono yellow Han deck as well, giving you really interesting play patterns where you have Han Solo as a 7-cost and DJ as a 7-cost, and your opponent, you know what? They can't play around both of those things at the same time. It's very, very difficult. They do completely different things. So Han, you know, he's been elevated. I put him above these other 7s now because of the meta that exists and the cards around it. I could see the sequence of these cards changing over time based on like what's popular, what leaders are being played, but I put Han at the top of that list right now. And, you know, we talk a lot about Han. Let's just talk about Tech and DJ right now. Now, I almost gave them separate slides, but, you know, there is a synergy between them, specifically in the Han Solo leader deck where, you know, you can Tech and then get this DJ out for 5 resources. It's like a wombo combo that your opponent needs to be aware of. It's very, very difficult to actually pull it off against an opponent that is paying attention, but it exists, and it means they have to kind of invest energy to make it not happen. Now, other than that, these cards do very powerful things independently of each other. So we'll start with DJ actually, where I think the main thing about DJ is not tech related. It's obviously just the Han leader related. The Han leader being able to blow up a resource that you don't own means that you can permanently de-ramp your opponent while permanently ramping yourself off of this synergy. It's a very, very crazy synergy. One of the most broken things you can do in the game right now, and very much goes against like most of the tenets of this game. It's a very, very difficult mechanic to interact with, but of course, you always have to be aware this guy comes out. You have to know how to sequence a turn so that if you don't have a way to one-shot this, you at least have maybe like 2 units in play, and you have to hold back your attacks so that you can clear the DJ. You potentially have to deploy leaders before this happens because, you know, there's situations where you know you can't prevent it, but at least you won't brick your whole leader flip, and maybe then your leader can interact with the DJ. But yeah, the DJ should be like when you sit across from your opponent and they're playing Han leader. This is like the picture of this guy needs to be plastered in your brain every turn of the game after the first two, basically. And Tech, on the other hand, you know, he is also most dominant in this Han deck because that deck plays incredibly powerfully from the resource row. It gets to accelerate resources with the Han ability. It gets to put like smuggle cards from his hand into the resource row where it can then play from the resource row very well. And that deck can grind very, very long, and Tech is a core element of that. Tech does see some splash play in other hero decks in games where you want to have some more attrition power. But yeah, I'd focus mostly on its interaction with all the smuggle in the Han deck. And again, this is like a kill on sight in most cases. And when you're playing with it, you really want to be careful about how you deploy it, because this can really steal games if you're able to get it out in a safe way. And yeah, I mentioned already the combo between them, of course, where Tech does make this DJ cost 5 from the smuggle, which means, you know, you can play a Tech on turn 2 and then in the Han deck get a DJ out on turn 3. You know, it's very telegraphed, but if your opponent can't do anything about it, it doesn't really matter how telegraphed it is. All right, we've got another set 3 card. This is Perilous Position. This has been a big upgrade for blue decks in general. Just a much better version of Make an Opening, basically. And Make an Opening is still a fine card, but this being a permanent debuff as well as an exhaust has made it be an incredibly powerful tool against leaders, in addition to the fact that it can clear really tricky units like Lurking TIE Phantom and 7th Fleet Defender, etc., etc. So Perilous can prevent a bunch of damage, even if it's not killing something, and still gets the kill. All those pesky units. Decks playing Lurking TIE Phantom really don't usually want to slam those Lurking TIEs on turn 2 anymore. They want to find ways to get those Lurking TIEs into play later in the game, where your opponent may have used Perilous Position, may have resourced one of them, and then like maybe much later might be able to sneak a win out with that Lurking TIE. But yeah, so Perilous has become a very core blue card for both heroes and villains. Just one of the best cards in set 3. And at 9, another blue card, I've got Vigilance here. I think probably the most powerful double aspect card in the game right now, and the only one that I am truly happy about playing at 6 resources. I don't think it's like tremendously powerful at 6, but it fills a very important role. It's kind of a bridge card, and by that I mean we're going from the mid game to the end game, and this kind of bridges those two things together, right? At 6, it's not doing anything like majorly broken, right? It's usually defeat something small and heal 5, but that could mean 8 damage or so worth of prevention. And your goal with these later game decks where you're going to 7 and 8 is that ideally those 7 and 8s are much more powerful than the things your opponent are doing, and they will help stabilize you and then turn the corner. But we need to get to them, right? We need to get to whatever it is we're playing at 7. Maybe that's a Vader or a Maul. Maybe it's like a double removal turn in a boss deck. Maybe we're trying to actually get to 8 where we can start playing Snokes, Reinforcement Walkers, Emperor Palpatine. Regardless of what it is you're doing, you need to actually survive long enough to do that. And Vigilance, although not like highlighting pure power on rate for 6, does help bridge you from that mid game to that late game, and because of that, it's become incredibly powerful even at 6. Now it has other modes, right? Of course, this the defeating cards from your opponent deck has become a very important part in hard control, where if you are playing into other long game decks, that becomes an alternate win condition for you. The shield, probably the least used mode, still has some use cases. And we haven't even talked about how good this card is at 4, and it is awesome at 4. Unfortunately, mono blue decks are not always at the best spot. My favorite right now would probably be a blue Ray deck. I think it's very much a deck meant to counter a couple of very specific decks, and it might have a little issue with like the mid-range piles in general. But Vigilance at 4 is a whole nother beast, because now Everything I said about it at 6 still applies, except it is no longer only a bridge card. It is just a stabilizing force. You get tons of value out of this card at 4 cost. And the shield mode actually becomes much more powerful earlier in the game as well. So Vigilance, yeah, core card. All right, Lurking TIE Phantom at number 8. So did talk about this card in the context of something like Perilous Position, but this, similar to Dark Saber, I mentioned, is like a game stealer. This thing does it too. When you play this card early and your opponent just doesn't have a way to do anything about it, they can be in a lot of trouble. This hits incredibly hard. 4 damage on a 3-drop is very, very powerful. And if you can't do anything about this, you will die very, very fast. Decks playing with this card want to find a way for this to stick without getting it just like cleanly traded. Of course, there's tons of space units in the game that just like delete this, but this card has become very, very effective in the Django deck because you can play it, and even if your opponent has space units coming down after, a lot of your other units can then exhaust. Something like a P-38 can come down and defend you from that space unit. Cartel Spacer can defend you, right? You have ways to interact with your opponent playing space units and then protect this Lurking TIE. So if your opponent's only way to interact with this are other units, you're sometimes covered from that. Against blue decks, you don't always want to just jam this out unless, of course, maybe you have multiples of them and you just want to tax your opponent's perilous positions. Some decks will start playing more copies of effects like that, like make an opening out of the sideboard, so it becomes even less likely that you can steal games with this. And of course, Snoke, if this hasn't done its thing before then, it can't really come into play after Snoke is out. So there is a lot of play around, similarly to Dark Saber, where there is a lot of play around, but it gets the nod here because, you know, it just does steal some games and requires also much less of investment than something like Dark Saber does. All right, 7 is 4 cards. We're just going to talk about discard kind of altogether. It's Spark of Rebellion, Kira, Bazine, and Bodhi. So the first 3 there, Bodhi is a little different. When you're playing against discard, you sometimes just have to change the way you think about how you sequence a turn, just to make sure your turn doesn't get bricked. Really common example is turn 3 when you're playing Django into a deck that might be playing something like Kira or Spark of Rebellion. You might just need to launch your triple Dark Raid first action, even if you have units to attack with, and even if those units could get traded out by something your opponent does, because if they Kira you and block your triple Dark Raid, maybe your whole turn is bricked. Django, for instance, does not really play any 4-cost cards. Triple Dark Raid is the 4-cost card because it costs 3, and then it goes and gets like a Ruthless Raider or a Fire Spray, and they both cost 2 less, right? So it ends up costing 4 in total. Same with Bazine, right? It can steal some of this. So now Bazine, a little different in the sense that it's not like the discard. You're not losing card advantage. You get the card back, and Bazine is kind of a low impact unit, but she's pretty powerful, especially with like CAD Bane, where the underworld ping works, and she does have the smuggle effect. But in general, when you're playing against discard, you need to be aware of this stuff. You also sometimes need to sandbag some extra cards or not resource as aggressively as you might into other matchups, because, you know, if you're drawing 2 and resourcing 1 and then getting cards discarded, you could end up in situations where you just don't have enough things to do. Now Bodhi is a little different. Now it still applies in some ways, right? Like the triple Dark Raid can still apply here, but there are ways to play around Bodhi that don't exist with these other cards, and that's notably resourcing events. The deck that really plays Bodhi is the Han Solo deck. They do sometimes try to do this guy on turn 1, and if you have the flexibility of just resourcing all your events on turn 1 into a Han deck, it's sometimes a good idea to do so, because if they do try for the greedy Bodhi turn 1 and whiff on it, they are in trouble because they just spent 2 cards to play a 3/3, and they don't get any card back from it. They also give up initiative in this play generally, so that can be a big problem. They like kind of 2-for-1 themselves. So there are ways to mitigate Bodhi's effect. think about him in general while you're playing. Like, how damaging would it be if a Bodhi came down and took this event from my hand right now? Of course, some decks need their events, so there's like tension there, and sometimes you just need to keep redundancy, and that's true with all this discard. Redundancy is important. Think you're a ramp deck, you got 2 resupplies in your hand. Nor you might think like, hey, I only ever need one of these. I'm gonna resource the other, but against these discard effects, you need to just maybe sometimes keeping duplicates. Like, I'm gonna keep both of these 4 drops because it plays around getting discarded, and then I'll just resource one of them next turn if I don't get discarded. So discard, knowing how to play around it and like when to deploy it as well. Like, when do you think snagging a card is going to be appropriate? I don't love doing it on turn 1. I think you can try to be sneaky, but in general, I don't like falling behind on turn 1. So like sparking on turn 1 is not generally advisable for me. Bazine a little differently if you're like in the CAD Bane deck and you can get that ping off. She's also a bit of a like into like Tarkin Town decks. She's a bit of a like whatever target, and or if you have like something like McClunky, then like she becomes a better turn 1 play than something like Spark, but also not always what I want to do, because again, you end up falling behind on board when you go this route early on, and I think snagging important cards in different parts of the game is often more advisable. All right, number 6 is a 2-carder. It's Wrecker and Energy Conversion Lab. So, I wanted to include them together because kind of that's the point. This is one of the most powerful one-action things you can do in the game, right? An ECL Wrecker can kill 2 things and potentially do 5-6 damage to your opponent's base for 1 action, and you get to keep a 7 whatever in play as well. This is the identity of Sabine for me. Like, this is the looming threat. Anytime your opponent does an energy conversion lab earlier in the game and they can't do it with Wrecker anymore, that should feel pretty good most of the time. I know Poe is like the alternate version, and he is also very powerful. He made the honorable mentions because of this interaction as well, but Wrecker definitely is the spikier version of these effects. Play around. I mean, you have to know when it's coming and how much it's going to hurt, and then how you can get this guy off the table efficiently, because you can, of course, never let this hit you for 7 after, right? So you need to be able to remove it. Ideally, the turn it comes into play. Very difficult thing to maneuver sometimes. One-shots a bunch of leaders. So does Poe. I mean, they both basically one-shot all the playable leaders. It's interesting that like one of the premier aggro decks in the format also has like units that just like delete leaders. It makes that tech have much more like power, but it is a pretty linear sequence of things that happen, and at this point we've all played against this so much that we kind of know at times what we need to do to make this record less effective. But you can't hide forever, and even if at any point this deck is not the best, it might still be the best at another time, and I think this interaction will always be in the running for one of the most powerful single interactions in the game. All right, next we got another ambushy thing. This is Plo Koon and another set 3 card. Nice, right? We didn't get too many of them, but this one is one of the best. I've just been incredibly impressed with this card. Again, I've mentioned it with like the Han and stuff, but this also benefits a ton from Quinlan existing, right? Because you have a leader that can flip on the same turn that Plo Koon would come out, which means all you need is one other unit in play for this coordinate to be on. And then this coordinate in conjunction with Quinlan now means that it can deal 7 damage to 5 cost leaders, which means Django can get 1 shot, Quinlan and Amir can get 1 shot, Krennic can get 1 shot. So Plo, very, very powerful. The floor here is also not bad, right? The ambush on its own, just the 3/6, is powerful. It can do some things. This guy turns the corner incredibly well, right? Because you come in and remove something. If you're able to like maintain initiative going to the next turn, this can just hit for 6, right? That's huge. It makes these tempo-y yellow hero decks have way more closing speed than they otherwise would. Force is another incidental benefit here, but and it's very relevant because of some very powerful force cards. So Plo Koon is kind of a complete package. He's less good in like a mono yellow Han deck only because the leader itself doesn't sequence very well with this, so it's much harder to have that coordinate like online when you need it. But you know, it can still be decent there. You know, when you're playing around this guy, like, you can't just flip your leaders into a potential one shot from Plo. It's very similar to like playing around ECL with Poe and Wrecker in that sense, where you need your opponent to spend some amount of resources before you're comfortable deploying. Of course, the next turn, they like often doesn't actually end up being the card played on the 5 resource turn. It just ends up being the card played as first action on the 6 resource turn to defeat the leader that was flipped the turn before. So sequencing around this is tricky because of how powerful the card is on its own. But yes, you don't want to just deploy a unit or a leader into this knowing that it's just going to get deleted. You want to find ways to churn actions so that your opponent has to at least spend resources or maybe deploy the Plo into a weaker unit so that it doesn't get as much value. All right, at 4, I put Super Laser Blast. You know, this is we talked about bridging before, like with Vigilance. Well, this is what you bridge to a lot of the time. This is your hard reset. From here, if you've got a decent life pool and some finishers to follow up in your hard control decks, you usually look pretty good. This is a very important card, of course, for these decks. It gets played also in like not pure hard control, right? Like blue-green hero decks will sometimes play it, like with Palpatine, Kira, or Krennic, although not nearly as reliant on this effect as something like a Bosk blue deck is, or a mono blue villain deck, for instance. But yeah, like, it's a board wipe, so that's just always going to be something to think about when you're playing. Cards that are very good against this are like smuggle cards. I think some of my favorite cards are like Cassian, which not only smuggles but can hit for 3. Millennium Falcon, the 3-drop one that can immediately push damage, right? That way you're able to not only rebuild but deal damage the same turn. Those are very effective ways to deal with this. You usually don't want to follow this up with just one big unit because the follow-up to Super Laser Blast often is Avenger. So if you're just playing a big thing after you get super lasered, then, you know, they're just going to Avenger your big unit and probably lose on the spot. So you try to go, when not only that, when you're playing leading up to Super Laser Blast turns, you sometimes just don't, you want to like hold back a little bit. You want to put enough into play to make your opponent do it while not putting so much into play that you use up all your cards, right? If you don't put enough into play, they'll just continue with their 1-for-1 removal. They'll like Vigilance, they'll Fell the Dragon, Takedown, whatever it is, and they'll just like keep the game going longer because that will benefit the Super Laser Blast deck. So you have to like actually force them to do this. All right, at 3, Force Throw, maybe my favorite card in the game. I used to play this all the time with Churret. Still sometimes play Churret, although right now I think the best Force Throw deck is probably a Quinlan Red deck. Because, you know, you still have a very cheap Force leader. That deck is got so much disruption, and Force Throw works incredibly well when you chain it with other discard effects. And, you know, yellow's got Spark of Rebellion, so that adds to the discard effects. Red, of course, has more things like K2. Out of sideboards, you sometimes get Pillages. And, you know, there's so many more that I'm not just going to name them all. But anyway, Force Throw, the less cards your opponent in your hand, the more powerful it's going to be because it's going to hit the best cards left in your opponent's hand. Like, anytime you've had like one card in your opponent's hand, you just know it's something giant. So when you've like thrown a Luke Skywalker at like an Anakin leader or something, then you know you've lived. But yes, Force Throw, it costs 1. It is wildly efficient. In a pinch, you can throw your own cards to really brick your opponent. That's often much more of an effect you want to do when you're playing against like aggro decks like Sabine, where you know it's not going to end up being a card advantage battle, so you just want to like they flip Sabine, you just like throw a 5 cost at it and be done with it. It costs you 1 resource. And you also need to know that your opponent may, like, what's going to happen if your opponent like has a 1 cost in their hand, or how likely is it that they have a really cheap card in their hand that they're holding back, and how devastating is it for you if like whatever it is they toss with Force Throw isn't good enough to kill any of the units. You have ways to clean up, like Tarkin Town, for instance, or any additional pings, right? But when you're playing against this card, in contrast, you sometimes need to keep some cheaper cards and consider this. You need to be aggressively removing force units off the table because of how powerful this is when they have force units in play. But Force Throw, this is kind of the reason we play Force. It is by far the most powerful Force card in the game. It's not remotely close. And if we ever get more cards of this power level for Force, decks might start even playing weak Force units just to turn them on. All right, at number 2, we actually have 3 cards. Now, this is mostly a Ruthless Raider talk. It is the most important card on this screen. I do include Fet's Fire Spray and Triple Dark Raid here, but first of all, Triple Dark Raid probably just wouldn't get played at all if Ruthless Raider didn't exist. So that's kind of the first thing. It is the de facto best card Triple Dark Raid can ever hit, and it's kind of why we do it. In the Django deck specifically, this Ruthless Raider is out of control because it also exhausts unit on play and on defeat. The amount of damage this card puts out, with the Triple Dark Raid turn, it can put out 6, which is actually even more than Fet's Fire Spray, while also potentially preventing damage or killing a unit. It's absolutely nuts. Ruthless Raider also has upsides with things like sneak attack. So yeah, this is a Ruthless Raider talk, but I wanted to just like shout out the other kind of core components of this Django space deck. And Fet's Fire Spray, of course, is a very powerful card, and it comes in readied when you are playing as Django, so it gets a giant boost. There are times where it's actually the better card than Ruthless Raider because, when you're actually playing it for 6, it pushes more damage. This will close quicker. And then Triple Dark Raid's kind of your unfair thing, right? Like, anytime you've Triple Dark Raid and hit Ruthless Raider, it's just like, wow, like, this shouldn't be allowed. And when you've played against Django, doesn't it always feel Ruthless Raider comes out like 100% of the time? It definitely feels that way sometimes. But this deck, the Django stuff with Triple Dark Raid, or, even if you're not playing Django, you end up finding so many of these bombs because Triple Dark Raid kind of self-tutors for them. And then they go back into your hand, which means you replay them, right? So you don't run out. Like, it's just a lot of steam, and this whole package of cards is like a very dominant strategy right now. It's one of the best decks in the game when you're talking about the Django Triple Dark Raid deck. And Ruthless Raider, that card is very powerful even outside of this. I think this is one of the best villain red cards in general. Like, even a deck that doesn't play Triple Dark Raid, something like a CAD Bane deck, for instance, will play Ruthless Raider because of how good this card is against control decks, or like basically any slow decks, like Kira, Krennic, Palpatine, of course, like boss decks. Like this, the thresholds on it not being able to get hit by Fel, the dragon, or take down, the fact that it minimum does 4 damage because of the when played and defeated effect. It's just a house. It's so good. All right, the number 1 most important card right now, it is Tarkin Town. It's overtaken Energy Conversion Lab somehow as like probably the most dominant base in the game right now. I think there's been a few things that has really like elevated this, right? So Quinlan's a new leader that has built-in ping damage, right? So that already ties into Tarkin Town. CAD Bane was already very good with Tarkin Town, but was also being held back a little bit by being like a slower mid-rangier deck when the Boba Menace was around. So CAD Bane's play rate was able to increase when Boba got suspended. On top of that, we also see Django now playing Tarkin Town because we have new incidental ping damage, something like P38 to enable Tarkin Town, in addition to Django already wanting his units to do ping damage, right? ISB agent being a pretty good synergy with his effect, Ruthless Raider, P38, right? So all of a sudden we want to put these pings in our deck, in this Django deck. So bam, Tarkin Town. Such an important card right now. Decks have to, you really need a lot of practice knowing like when it's appropriate to not play a card on turn one or pass, or like the claim pass dynamic between decks that are both playing Tarkin Town, right? You can't play around it forever. It needs to go away. At some point, your opponent will get value out of this. But knowing ways to sequence, knowing when you need to underdrop into Quinlan, for instance, so that they can't ping, or knowing as a Quinlan player when you need to hold back cards so you can underdrop into your opponent. It makes one-cost cards more effective if you're doing this underdrop stuff. So things like Daring Raid, which also incidentally enables this Tarkin Town. Force Throw is another cheap card, right, that you can sequence into these turns. One-cost units, like I see Sabine decks sometimes playing more one-cost units so that they can go 2+1 on turn 2 and not have to jam a 3-drop, or even 2 turn 1 drops, so that even if they get Tarkin Town, they have something left in play. So yeah, like Tarkin Town, like a lot of decks are just playing it right now, and it's really changing the way you need to construct decks. It's made 5 health units on turn 2 much more important because they don't get pinged and then Tarkin Towned. It's made shielded units much safer turn 1 plays, so more play from things like Crafty Smuggler and Leet Droid. So there's just a lot going on with this, and yeah, I think like maybe in other sets we would have seen Energy Conversion Labs sitting at this number 1 slot. I think right now Tarkin Town is kind of the name of the game. Whether or not you're playing it or not, it should be really in the forefront of your mind. All right, that's all I got. Appreciate you sticking around. Let me know if there's any cards that you think I left out, maybe any cards that shouldn't have been on this list. Happy to hear your thoughts. Once again, please hit that subscribe button if you can, and check out the Patreon if you want some more content from me. And until next time, take care.